Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting guest tonight, an author, a poet. Sheila Stewart is her name. Her latest poetry collection is called If I Write About My Father, and it was recently released. This collection, get this, dismantles the patriarchal religious ideology. The patriarchal religious ideologies of Sheila's upbringing by a Protestant minister while sustaining the emotional intimacy experienced in family relationships. Sheila was the only daughter of a United Church minister. They came from Northern Ireland, where he was with the Protestant Church, and then joined the United Church upon coming to Canada, and worked in a couple small towns in Ontario as well as outside of Montreal. What a fascinating sort of background. And then to write about it in poetry is interesting. And Sheila, this is not your first book about your family of poetry. I understand you've done this before. So what motivated you to write a book of poetry about your father and your relationship with your father?
Thanks so much, Brian. It wasn't kind of a conscious choice. I had written my first collection about my mother. It's called A Hat to Stop a Train. But in this case with my father, I was actually doing a PhD at the Ontario Institute for the Study of Education at University of Toronto. And I kind of came up against issues around authority and finding my own voice in that writing. I was starting the PhD at 48. So, and things around my dad kept coming up. And I felt like some of the issues around authority and voice, in my family, we had my dad, a minister, kind of preaching at the dinner table and around the house, practicing his sermon for Sunday. And then I had two brothers who were 7 and 11 years older. So there were some kind of dominant voices in the family. And then my mom and I were both fairly quiet. But it's funny, I was working at the university and I had a dream the first night I worked there, and this is before starting the PhD. I was a research officer. I had this dream that in the corner of my office, my dad's clerical robes were hanging there, and the professor I was working with came in and he started exchanging the sacrament with the robes, but my dad's hands were coming out of the robes. So it was a strange dream, but some of the hierarchies of the university and church kind of had this echo. Yeah, yeah. Power dynamics and, different rituals. So it's with the book about my mom, I think I was really more, my mom passed away just when my second daughter was a couple months old, and my mom had precarious health. In the case of my mom, it was a bit more of an elegy. It was, wanting to preserve her stories for my daughters. It was more of a love story, I think. With my dad, it was kind of reckoning with him and sort of finding my own voice and wrestling with the church in a way.
Is your father still alive?
No, he's not. No, he died about 20 years ago.
I'm sorry to hear that. Did he read any of your poems about him?
No, he didn't. No, that would have been. It's funny because my mom read some that I had written about her, and my mom was, "Oh, Sheila, it's about me," But my dad believed that poetry should rhyme, and
if your father read your book or some of the poems in your book today, how do you think he would react? What would he say?
Well, he might be interested in a way in that he might see that I'm kind of wrestling with some things about religion and spirit. I'm not Christian, but culturally, definitely Christian. And he might appreciate some of it. But I'm also working through some of, he had a pretty bad temper, and I'm working through some of that. So
have your older brothers read the book?
Well, one of my older brothers has passed away, and the other one I think is reading it. He lives in Europe, so we haven't actually had a conversation about it. We've just sort of texted about the book launch, and
No reaction as of yet.
yeah.
So you talk about this patriarchal religious ideologies. What are patriarchal religious ideologies?
Well, notions of, I mean, there's different kinds of God, right? And I think when you're growing up and you're small, and your dad is at the front in the pulpit in his robes, um, dad and God, I think for us, when we were really young, we're a little bit confused, a little bit merged. Um, so in terms of patriarchal, my dad's from a small village in Northern Ireland and my mom's from a farm. So while I was growing up in the 60s, I think in a certain way, um, my parents weren't quite in North America in the 60s. Their upbringings were there with them, from an earlier time. So it was hard for me to have much of an opinion or be listened to. Um, that kind of
It's hard for
thing.
you to have an opinion or be listened to.
Yeah, yeah. It was a kind of children should be seen and not heard. Yeah.
So a former moderator of the United Church, I think I'm not sure whether it was the first female, but a female moderator of the United Church just passed, and I read her obituary,
Mm,
and I remember her speaking. And one of the things she did, and this was referenced in the obituary, was that she would tell people to think of God as potentially female, and how would you
mm,
react differently if God was female, if it was a she,
mm,
not a he. Have you ever
mm.
considered that?
Well, I do kind of, if I think of a notion of God, I often think of God as more female than male. But it's funny the different strands of thinking. And because, your question about what my dad would make of this book is an interesting one. And, shortly before the launch, which happened yesterday, I had, a couple of moments of like, I'm going to be struck down by the hand of God. Like, I should not have written a book. We should not speak ill of the dead, and I should not have disparaged my dad. But I think, this is not really it's in no way a biography of my dad, and it's not so much clearly about him. It's about him and my growing up, but much more it's about kind of, the institution of the church, which we grew up in a way that we saw the backstory of everything. We kind of knew in any congregation, there's the more powerful families, there's the people on the official board, there's the different alliances within congregations. So we saw kind of, and I think my dad was a very good preacher and really good at pastoral care. He loved meeting people, especially seniors, and working with them. But I
You
think
can't be good at pastoral care if you don't listen.
yeah, yeah. I think he was really good at listening, and I think he had to give
But he didn't
his
listen to you.
no, I don't not no. He had to give his energy to his work first, which is what a lot of men did in the 50s, 60s, but also he had sometimes 500 families and all of their cares. So at any given time there'd be maybe someone who just died, a number of other people in hospital, people going through different things, and we kind of knew about these concerns.
It's interesting when you talk about this institution of the church and this patriarchal ideology. The United Church is sometimes thought of as not even a church. It's like a community club, with the Roman Catholic faith, or evangelical churches. One would potentially think of more institutional in nature. The
Mhm.
United Church is more fluid, is it not? And yet you still had that sense within your own family and church.
Well, I think it's sort of the different eras, because I think you're quite right with the progressive nature of the United Church, um, particularly now and like in a city like Toronto. Um, I took my daughters to Trinity St. Paul's United Church when they were little, just kind of exploring a little bit. But growing up, 60s, 70s, Stratford, Waterloo, and then Roxborough United Church, it was a different time. And my dad was, I could say, liberal or NDP, like kind of progressive in terms of politics. But when it came to social issues, he was really very traditional.
I dated some daughters of ministers, and it was interesting. So I can understand a little bit about where you're coming from. We got to take a break for some messages.
Okay.
We're going to come back in just 2 minutes with Sheila Stewart, and we're going to ask her to read one or two of her poems. Stay with us, everyone. Back in
Okay.
2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with poet Sheila Stewart, and she's written a book, a poetry collection called If I Write About My Father. Lots of us would, I think, like to write some stories or a book or some poems about our fathers. Um, and it's interesting because Sheila explores the daughter-father relationship, uncovering the complexities of growing up as the minister's only daughter in a family shaped by church and manse in a small town, southern Ontario town. Stewart, she braids the narrative and lyric, the textures of liturgy and memory, while critiquing patriarchal weight and constraint. The work explores how her particular religious upbringing shapes thinking, the rhythms of language, and the fabric of consciousness. So my family was very involved in the church, elders and whatnot, and I went to church camp. My mom was president of church council, church board council, and my brother ended up becoming a United Church minister. And so I didn't have the father influence that you talked about, though he was my dad was very involved in the church as well. But I've got some of the similar kind of backgrounds to you, so I'm really interested
Mhm.
in your book and what your stories are all about. And as I said before the break, I actually dated some daughters of United Church ministers,
Mhm.
and actually of some other religions as well. So tell me, read if you could one of your poems, and let's get a
Sure.
sense of what you've got to say about your father in poetry.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Brian. I'm going to read the very first poem in this book. It's a short poem, and it's called Altar. Altar. I set up altars everywhere I go, polished pocket stone, daisy or dandelion in a pinch, shell shaped like an ear, a bowl of water, comfort. I'm not religious. No, no, no. I say no, no, no. Leave that in question or alter. And the last altar there is Alter. So I think I'll read the second poem as
Well,
well.
just before you do that,
One,
what was your PhD in?
it was in education. Yeah, adult education and community development. My
And
first degree was English and philosophy, but then I did a number of education degrees.
and what was your research question in your PhD?
Well, I actually looked at shame, grief, and silence.
Shame,
And
grief, and
shame,
silence.
grief, and
And
silence. Yeah.
why were you motivated to look at shame, grief, and silence?
Well, these things came up for me in wrestling with this issue of authority. Um, Now, I had also done adult literacy work in Parkdale and elsewhere. Parkdale Project Read, a really good program. So, shame is something that we often see in adult literacy learners who feel badly about their poor literacy skills. Um, but I encounter it in myself as well, and I think it's a little bit of an echo of this church upbringing. Um, Actually, I've got a poem that might be kind of interesting to read.
About
It
shame.
has it has a line about it. Yeah.
Okay, please do.
Okay. And this is called Napkin. So this poem is set in Stratford, where I lived until I was 9. It's interesting with this poem. Sometimes I read the whole poem. I think I'll read the whole poem today. And sometimes I sort of read part of it. Napkin. Cream linen napkins, unused, still stiff with sizing, ironed creases. I hold one up to the window, see through the wide weave of this square, the yellow irises and blue bicycle in the garden. At Nora's house, they ate hamburgers and hot dogs, Canadian food, paper napkins. At 6, I'd never eaten spaghetti. My large plate steaming, meat sauce over a nest of long, pale noodles. How to lift them? Pulling my chair in quickly, crash, huge mess on legs and floor, plate chunks in brown clumps of tomato, sauce splattered across Nora's dad's black shoes. No yelling, just some jokes. Nora's mum set another plate before me. I watched them twirl forkfuls. They didn't shame me. That was already there. Linen napkin covering my lap.
So did you have shame in your house? If you had spilt, you would have had not such a quiet response?
Not, yeah, not such a quiet response. So I think, shame's quite a complex emotion to write about. And poetry, like Emily Dickinson says, we tell the truth, but we tell it slant, right? There's kinds of ways of telling stories or evoking images. So I think that's kind of what I do here. I tell the story of a place where there wasn't a sense of shame, even though I felt very horrible and embarrassed at the
Why,
moment.
why did you lose your connection to religion?
Well, I mean, um, I don't, I think as a young teenager, I didn't really, I wasn't sure about there being a God. Remain really fascinated by religion. It's like the stories, it gives people meaning. I'm interested in the great variety of religions. But I can't say I believe in God. I have gone to church sometimes and took my daughters when they were young. Like it's a beautiful community place. Um, but for me, I practice yoga on a Sunday morning. I walk in nature. I think that's where I find more of a spiritual connection.
There was
Yeah,
a
really High
really,
Park and Lake Ontario kind of speak to me
yeah, yeah,
in a
and I
way.
think a lot of people are finding that spiritualism in nature and Mother Nature these days. There was a really interesting article in the Sunday New York Times this past week about the surprise at how many evangelical pastors and just regular ministers, gospel churches and mainline churches in Dallas had had resigned because of inappropriate behaviors with parishioners and extramarital relations and things like this. And it was almost suggesting that there was something about, particularly when there was a lack of an institution. You talked about the institution, but when there was a lack of an institution, and they ended up having these large churches with big followings and were treated almost like God, as you say, that they often did inappropriate things.
Mhm.
Have you thought about sort of any of the challenges that our religious leaders have had and how that's come about? Not in any way, shape, or form suggesting that your father was connected with
Mhm.
that, but this idea that you said that he looked like and felt like God up there on the
Mhm.
on the altar.
Yeah. Well, I think that when people are in a position of power and they're revered in that way, and they are connecting with people at vulnerable moments, I think, yeah, there's abuse through a lot of churches, as we know, and as we didn't, it's come to light in the last number of decades. But it's there in a lot of other places as well. Um, yeah, it's a tragedy, really, for the people involved.
You
Yeah.
talk about the patriarchy.
Yeah, it's
Some people
interesting,
don't.
patriarchy. That word is used about my book, and I'm interested in the word, but in poetry, I use kind of these down to earth words.
What's a down to earth word instead of patriarchy?
Well, I guess I talk about father, and I mean father in a kind of broader sense, right? Like there's a number of fathers we have. There's different institutional leaders. Um, but yeah, patriarchy, I mean, it's partly because of my parents being from, rural and small village Ireland and then immigrating. My dad grew up in the Presbyterian church there,
You
and
you
that was the church he served in first.
you were going to read us a poem about the Troubles and that
Yeah,
connected with Northern Ireland. Is that something you could do as well?
I will for sure. I'd like to. This one is called Billy Stewart's Geography, and my dad was Billy Stewart. And this poem was inspired by finding his notebook. I found this at my aunt's house and started reading through it and his penmanship. Um, so the poem includes some words and lines from the notebook. So maybe when I'm reading on the page, they're indented. But when I'm reading those, maybe I'll just indicate like this. So you kind of can
Okay, great.
can can hear that that's my dad's voice. Um, all right. Billy Stewart's Geography. There was a dark tunnel which we all knew about. See him at a school desk with an inkwell, carefully dipping his pen, copying from the board circa 1930. He'd made a table of contents inside the front cover of his hardcover notebook. Although Abyssinia is very mountainous, it is making wonderful progress under Italian control. My schoolboy father tours me through Ceylon, Rhodesia, Belgian Congo, Italian East Africa rivers and trade. Liberia, a very backward state. This is again from my dad's notebook, founded for liberated American slaves. The Sahara, wherever water reaches the surface, an oasis is found. These oases differ in size from a few square yards to areas as big as Ulster. Once a year, on the 14th of July, my father goes to Warren Point on the Irish Sea. The trio of festival days begins with the 12th. The Orangemen come to Tandragee with their brigade. The painted banners display their lodge number, and King William on a white horse emerging from the Boyne River. Mothers and children line the streets, cheer on their menfolk as they march and drum. The crowd compares the men on parade from Ballymore, Pordrain, Tullamacan, and beyond. My father's sisters and mothers start making ice cream at 5 a.m., sell out by mid-afternoon. The 13th brings the sham fight, where people enact the battle. Who won? Ask Roman Catholics, as they're called in Tandragee. Who won? The odd Protestant asks. From Christmas on, the children dream of the Sunday school excursion. They arrive at the station early, clutching their train tickets and food chits. My father told me there was a dark tunnel which we all knew about, and as the slow train went through it, boys kissed girls and everyone ended up in different seats. Newry Station, 10 kilometers to Warren Point, and the great day began. On the last page, 100 years ago, Canada was roamed by hunters. The Hudson Bay Company was king. Today, there are 10.5 million inhabitants. The natives have dwindled. Today, they are given settlements. There are only 100,000 Indians. Each page of the notebook filled. The schoolmaster's text, copy from book to board to notebook. There was a dark tunnel, which we all knew. What does it mean to have his notebook? In 1955, my parents and older brothers came to Canada, vast compared to Northern Ireland. By the time I was born, the wee Canadian, they were longing for elsewhere. As a United Church minister, did my dad know about the Mohawk Institute Residential School, Brantford, 1828 to 1970? Did he approve? Closed when I was 10. I visited it later as a museum. What does it mean to have his memoirs, a plain man's life story, stored in a box at the back of my closet, typed on his heavy black Remington? Dad, did you really think the 12th was fun for Catholics? William of glorious, of pious and immortal memory? Did you know about the Gordon Indian Residential School in Punachie, Saskatchewan, begun in 1889, closed in 1996? I didn't know. I was 35 when it closed. There was a dark tunnel, maps and pages failing.
Very powerful. It almost sounds like you blame your father for some of the failings of the church hundreds of years before, or 100 years before he arrived in Canada.
Well, I don't blame him, no, but I kind of wrestle with myself as a settler, like a white Canadian, trying as we are now to learn about Indigenous people. Certainly when I grew up in Stratford and Waterloo, I didn't know anything about the Indigenous people who lived in that area, right? And it was really my daughter, when she began to learn about residential schools, that she said, did Grandpa know about this? And I said, well, I'm not really sure.
What's the name of the book, and where can we get it?
It is If I Write About My Father by Sheila Stewart. It's available at Another Story bookstore here in Toronto on Roncesvalles, but you can also get it through my publisher, which is Ecstasis Editions, and they are out of Victoria.
Sheila Stewart, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. That was very powerful.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brian, for having me.
We're going to take
really
a break and come back with a different author in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.